President, Father President Emeritus, Director of this wonderful institute, distinguished members of the Congress conference meeting at this time, and all of you wonderful ladies and gentlemen, friends. I wonder whether we might not all want to stand for a moment or so in memory of those who died 2 years today, and those who died in other parts of the world in the aftermath of that horrendous event. Could we please stand? Thank you. Thank you so very much for the kind invitation to address you. And thank you, Father President, for your kind, warm words of introduction and welcome. My wife and I, a few years ago, were in Atlanta. Actually, it was at the time of the Olympic Games, and we were on Marta, the local train, and somebody thought they recognized me, and came up, and a few others came up and asked for autographs, and trying to look suitably modest, I was signing these autographs, and then a lady came up and joined them and sort of shoved a piece of paper up to me, and as I was signing, she turned to these other people and said, "Who is he? Who is he?" I thought that was rather good for the soul. But thank you for letting me come here. We will be celebrating a decade of freedom and democracy in South Africa next year, commemorating, as we will then be doing, that wholly unexpected and quite spectacular victory over one of the world's most vicious political systems, and commemorating the relatively peaceful transition from repression to freedom in 1994. Who will ever easily forget those long, long lines of South Africans of every race winding their way slowly to the polling booths on that magical, not to be forgotten day, April the 27th, 1994. Many had predicted that South Africa would be overwhelmed by the most awful racial bloodbath. It did not happen. We are the beneficiaries of much love and commitment and fervent prayer by millions in the international community. People boycotted South African goods on our behalf. They demonstrated and held rallies for us, and many were arrested on our behalf. I remember at about that time visiting the United States and going to some of the university and college campuses. And it warmed the cockles of my heart. I don't know what cockles are, but I mean, they... the cockles of my heart were warmed because one came at a time when students by right ought to have been worrying about exams and grades and things of that sort. And it was just fantastic going to these places and finding students boycotting, holding rallies on our behalf, often seeking to urge, compel their institutions to divest. We can never thank you enough. I can, without being presumptuous, say I know I speak on behalf of millions of my compatriots when I say to you all, especially to young people, students, thank you, thank you, thank you. We are able to say we will be celebrating 10 years of freedom and democracy because of you and those such as yourselves out there who supported our struggle against apartheid. We are free today because of you. We're striving to be democratic, to be non-racial and non-sexist because of you. It is a debt we will never be able to repay. And I sometimes said, I would like to give you a very warm clap, but it would look a little odd if I was doing it all by myself. So I asked you to join me in giving you and all of those many, 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 many others out there a very, very warm hand. That's actually lousy. That's not how you clap people when you have been helped and they've removed shackles that were binding you. No, actually, I in fact have a magic wand. You are very shy and reserved. So this magic wand, when I wave it over you, it's going to turn you into instant South Africans, right? So I wave it over you. Fellow South Africans, let's give these people Thank you. Now, I wave it again and you revert to your normal size. I did something of this kind once. I was in Australia speaking to a group of 2,000 young people, and I said, part of our problem is that we don't celebrate who we are. How about giving ourselves a warm hand? And they did a wonderful sort of roof-shattering performance. And then I said, how about giving God a standing ovation? And at the end, without thinking, I said, thank you. But thank you very much. Because it is actually very difficult to convey. It is something in very many ways ineffable. How do you tell people what it means to be free when for so long you were unfree? You can't describe that. And in many, many ways, it is very difficult to convey to those who have never been unfree what it means. And sometimes when people say, have things changed? You say, well, actually, in a lot of ways, things have not changed. And yet, in the most fundamental ways, things have changed. We are free. We are free. We are free. And you helped us to get there. Like this choir that was here, singing some of our songs. You know, you used to go to extraordinary places and be surprised how they could sing and pronounce difficult Xhosa names. Yes, I think we ought to give that choir just another little, you know, that's just, you. Most expected that once a black-led government was installed, then South Africa would see an orgy of retribution and revenge as blacks went on the rampage, giving vent to all their pent-up fury for all those many, many years when they suffered untold misery, all because of their ethnicity, their race, their skin color. One of the songs of our struggle is a haunting melody that asks plaintively in Xhosa, what have we done? Our sin is our blackness. Senzenina, 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 sono sethu bubu mnyama, sono sethu bubu mnyama, sono sethu bubu mnyama, sono sethu bubu mnyama. Yes, the conventional expectation that the post-conflict period would be a time of reckoning. Instead, the world was awed by the spectacle of the truth and reconciliation process, when victims of frequently gruesome atrocities revealed a mind-boggling nobility and generosity of spirit in their magnanimous willingness to forgive the perpetrator. Our country rejected the twin options of a type of Nuremberg trial and the general amnesia of blanket amnesty. We resolved to look the beast in the eye, to let victims tell their story, to risk opening wounds which had seemed to have been healed when they were really festering. We opened those wounds, cleansed them, and poured on the balm of a acknowledgement, the balm of giving voice to hurt, of rehabilitating the dignity of those who for so long were the anonymous, faceless ones, the victims. Perpetrators were given the chance to come to terms with what they had done, to make a full disclosure, and then to obtain amnesty. An example of restorative justice, which was more about healing than about punishment, more about forgiveness and reconciliation than about retribution and revenge. We knew that none of us possesses a fiat. We are not God, so that we could pronounce, let bygones be bygones, and they would thereby be bygones. We knew that the deeds of the past had an uncanny capacity to return and haunt people. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was a way of hope, a way of faith in the fundamental goodness of people, that we would not give up on anyone, that even the worst perpetrator still remained a child of God with a capacity to change, that each of us has the capacity to become a saint. Forgiveness and reconciliation have been shown not to be nebulous, namby-pamby things. No, they are the stuff of real politics. The alternative, the way of revenge, of retribution, leads to a ghastly cul-de-sac, the spiral of reprisal, provoking counter-reprisal ad infinitum, ending with no security, no peace, but a toll in human lives and property that is inexorable and exorbitant. It is not to be merely idealistic to say that without forgiveness there is no future. It is being a hard-nosed realist. Just ask the people of the Middle East, of Northern Ireland, of Sri Lanka, of Rwanda. True peace and real security will never come from the barrel of a gun, however overwhelming the firepower. Peace and security come because all enjoy justice and freedom. Peace and security come because it is acknowledged that people matter. Apartheid was vicious. Having refined the racism that had been part and parcel of the South African way of life from the moment white people encountered the indigenous people of that part of the continent. I speak to very knowledgeable people such as yourselves, but let me be allowed to justify their having paid my fare here. It was a policy of exclusion. The vast majority of the people were excluded from all real political decision-making, which gave access to all other kinds of power, other rights and resources. We were talked about. We were legislated for. They, the powerful, hardly talked to us. And yet you could say most of the work of Parliament, indeed of all white politics in South Africa, had to do with how you deal with the natives, the blacks, those people. White-only elections were won by the party that demonstrated that it knew how to keep the black properly in his place. And so you had the past laws which restricted black movement severely in the land of their birth. Blacks were temporary sojourners in so-called white South Africa, so there was no point in building houses for them in those urban areas. Do you see what I'm seeking to establish? That almost all our problems now are a legacy, the ghastly legacy of apartheid. Of course, many have since been exacerbated by what we have subsequently decided would be public policy. It is not looking for a convenient scapegoat. It is so that we will make a realistic assessment of our situation and prescribe appropriate remedies. So if you don't build houses, as was public policy and apartheid, then you should not be surprised that there will be a horrendous backlog. And when influx control under the past laws is lifted, then those who were locked in the poverty-stricken homelands will stream to the cities whose streets it is fondly imagined from time immemorial to be lined with gold. So we should not be surprised at the so-called informal settlements, these slums, the shacks that have mushroomed all over the place in our country. The migratory labor system played havoc with black family life when the father alone was allowed into the white area to lead an unnatural life in a single-sex hostel, prey to drunkenness, prostitution, drugs, and other antisocial conduct, whilst his family, whom he would not see for 9 to 12 months, eked out a miserable existence in the arid, under-resourced rural area. The White Dutch Reformed Church, which at the time provided theological justification for apartheid, had castigated the system as a cancer. There was a race classification act according to which all of the people of our country were branded like so many animals. The methods to determine race were often crude and unscientific, like they stick a pin unexpectedly in the victim and assign a race label according to his shriek of pain. If you say, Aina, then say, colored, Achu, Bantu, or by putting a comb through a person's hair. And if you have hair like mine, the comb sticks. If you have wavy hair, then you belong in another race group. Sometimes siblings were assigned to different race groups because one was of a darker hue than others. Children sometimes committed suicide when this happened, for whiteness was the open sesame to massive privilege and benefit. There was a Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act which prohibited marriages between whites and people of other races, and the Immorality Act which prohibited sexual relations between whites and people of other races. People committed suicide for being accused under this legislation. It made sordid something that should have been beautiful and noble, love between two persons. By law, blacks were confined to owning only 13% of the land while comprising 80% of the population. And the remaining 20%, whites enjoyed the other 87%. The apartheid government spent nearly 10 times per annum on a white child's education what it spent on a black child. This inequity was compounded by the introduction of Bantu education, which was deliberately inferior. Nothing about even the fiction of separate but equal. They knew they were fobbing off our children with an inferior and poisonous gruel designed to turn them into docile, kowtowing, perpetual serfs. After all, Dr. Verwoerd made no bones about the aims of Bantu education. He maintained that there was no point in teaching blacks mathematics. Let them know enough English and Afrikaans to be able to understand the instructions of their white boss and missus. He was unashamedly forthright. Our children wonderfully rejected what they called gutter education in the Soweto uprising of June the 16th, 1976. Education through high school was free for whites and not for blacks who were often not able to afford it. It was the same in every sphere of life. The Job Reservation Act prohibited blacks from performing certain skilled work, and now you hear whites bleating about affirmative action. Our country had pioneered the first heart transplant, showing we were up there with the best in sophisticated medical technology. But people were dying of cholera simply through a lack of clean water. We have to add that the people referred to were, of course, black people. Hardly any white died of cholera. They had readier access to very adequate medical care. Black people, especially in the rural areas, trudged long distances to rivers to collect often polluted river water and chop down trees for fuel, and so encouraged soil erosion. In the meantime, wires bearing electricity passed overhead these farm areas. In addition to all of this was the daily grind of being humiliated and treated as something to be spoken of in the third person, a non-European, a non-white, a non-entity. It did not take long from being spoken of as a non-entity to being treated as nothing, as not counting for much. Sadly, devastatingly, it did not take long for many so treated to think of themselves as non-entities, with a sense of self-hatred, knowing at the very vitals of one's being, causing us to doubt that we too were God's children. The utter blasphemy of it all, almost to spit in the face of God. Yeah. When you look back on it, you have to say the magnanimity of those made to suffer so was magnificent. They had every reason to want to pay back in the same coin. Ubuntu prevented it. Ubuntu. They knew that their humanity was caught up in the humanity of the other. That we are created, yes, for family. We are created for togetherness, for sharing, for existing in a delicate network of interdependence, and hatred and anger and revenge were corrosive of this summum bonum, this greater good of communal harmony. How one wishes that there were a magic wand such as the one I had at the beginning, which one could wave and hey presto, all the awfulness would be changed into its glorious counterpart. We have set ourselves high and noble goals in the new South Africa, but it is going to take us a long while to attain them without substantial help from our allies in the international community. Our Constitution entitles every South African to a decent home, to adequate health care, to a good education, to the so-called economic, cultural, and social rights. And our highest court, the Constitutional Court, has declared that these are enforceable. They are not just nice ideals to strive after. Quite recently, that court gave two particularly significant judgments: that government within reason must provide its citizens with decent housing, and found in favor of those who were demanding antiretroviral treatment for people living with HIV/AIDS. So they are not just theoretical rights ensconced in a paper constitution. People can sue the government if they think that they are being denied their constitutional rights enshrined, in our case, in the Bill of Rights at the beginning of our Constitution. We frequently celebrate what people elsewhere take so very much for granted, the arrival of clean piped water to a previously deprived community. The authorities have set a target of 250,000 houses to be constructed per annum. Education is universally free to the end of high school, but it is a right determined by availability of resources. And healthcare is free up to the age of 6 years and for expectant mothers. Concentration is on primary health care with the building of clinics, especially in the rural areas. We're being overwhelmed by the devastating HIV/AIDS pandemic. Wonderfully, though most of the victims are black, it is heartwarming to see just how many white South Africans are working assiduously to combat this scourge. We have seen in Zimbabwe what can happen when the vexed question of land possession is not dealt with expeditiously and carefully. Our government is following an orderly and legal method to restore land to its former dispossessed owners in its land restitution programs. Women are coming more and more into their own. We're striving to be gender sensitive, and we have many splendid women, especially in the public sector, but there is no room for complacency. We face enormous problems posed by poverty, crime, disease, and corruption. In our Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, we declare that unless the gap between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots, was reduced drastically, we could just as well kiss reconciliation goodbye. In many ways, we are sitting on a powder keg in South Africa. I am still amazed at the patience of our people. Many, far too many, still live in squalor, poverty, and deprivation, in shacks without running water or electricity. Every day, they wake up early in the morning to take a crowded train, a bus or taxi to town, to the salubrious, affluent suburbs, whose citizens are still largely white, although not exclusively so, with beautiful, well-built homes, with all the mod cons, and they, the blacks, are the domestic workers, the cooks, the cleaners, the childminders, the gardeners, the drivers, all who make it possible for the wealthy to work, and in the evening, they leave it all to return to their squalor and poverty. I have wondered when they will get incensed and lose their patience and say to hell with Madiba, Nelson Mandela, and Tutu with their reconciliation, and go on the rampage. We have said to our white compatriots, transformation of the physical, material circumstances of these deprived ones is not altruism. It is the best form of self-interest. It is so globally that we are unlikely to win the war against terrorism as long as there are conditions which make people so desperate because of their poverty, of their deprivation, their illnesses, their lack of security. Conditions making them so desperate that they are ready to commit acts of terrorism. It is in our best interests in South Africa and everywhere to try to achieve the Millennium Development Goals, to have poverty. We want to eradicate it in South Africa, to provide free education, to make health care readily available to all, to reduce infant mortality, to advance the cause of women, to deal with AIDS, TB, and malaria, and to remove slums. I think we are doing well, but we can do better. We thought people might be moved to seek revenge. We listened some heartrending accounts of what people had experienced. And then, when you expected them to explode, you were amazed at the nobility, the generosity of human beings. I have frequently said, you know, during the process of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we were frequently devastated to discover the depth to which we human beings can sink. The levels of depravity of which all of us, each and every one of us, is capable. That yes, we have an extraordinary capacity for evil. And one would sometimes tell the story of how someone comes before the amnesty committee and says, we gave him drugged coffee, we shot him in the head, and we burnt his body. And because it takes all of those many hours, 6, 7 hours, for a human body to burn, as that body was burning on that pyre, we were enjoying a barbecue and drinking beer. And you say, what could possibly have happened to the humanity of these persons that they could be able to enjoy themselves, as it were, burn two different kinds of flesh? Yes, that was devastating. But you know, dear friends, it was not the whole story. Exhilaratingly, wonderfully, we discovered too that each and every one of us has an extraordinary capacity for good. A teenager testified before the commission. Her father was one of what we called in South Africa the Kroc 4. 4 ANC activists who were killed quite gruesomely by the police, who then burnt their car. She came to speak, to testify before the commission in a packed hall. When she finished her testimony, I asked her, do you think you would be able to forgive those who did this to your father? And with a maturity beyond her years, this young woman, her name is Babalwa, meaning the blessed one, said, and you could hear the proverbial pin drop in this city hall. She said, we would like to forgive. We just want to know whom to forgive. and you get to realize then this incredible thing about us, about you, about me, that you and I, in fact, are made for goodness. You and I are made for compassion and gentleness and caring and sharing. We're made for we're made for God. We finite creatures are made for the infinite. Thou hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee. And you say, you know, human beings are fundamentally good. We are fundamentally good, the aberration is the bad. And God has a dream. God has a dream that one day you and I will realize that we belong God's family. That we are sisters and brothers, black, white, rich, poor, beautiful, not so beautiful, educated, uneducated. There are no outsiders in God's family. All. If I be lifted up, will draw all, not some, all. Arabs, Jews, all belong. All. Gay, lesbian, straight, all meant to be held in this incredible embrace of the one who will never let us go. God's dream. So we discover a God who has an incredible sense of humor. Who in their right mind could ever have imagined that South Africa would be the example of, accept to be the example of the most ghastly awfulness. An example of how you don't deal with problems. And God sets up South Africa. And you can imagine someone saying, God, are you serious? I mean, you mean this South African? God says, I mean, you know these guys. And God says, I said, precisely because they can't have been thought to be virtuous. Just look at how long they supported apartheid. They can't even be thought to have been smart. And you know the story of the South African who was upset that the Soviet Union, there was still a Soviet Union, and the United States were getting all the kudos for their space program. And the South African said, we in South Africa are going to launch a spacecraft to the sun, no less. People say, what? To the sun, yes, to the sun. And they say, hey man, long before it reaches the sun, it will be burned to cinders. I said, you think we in South Africa are stupid? We are going to launch it at night. Yeah. But God chooses this unlikely lot. Totally unexpected lot. And God says, yes, they can be, they will be a beacon of hope. If they can do it in South Africa, given the kind of antecedents that they had, if it could happen in South Africa, it can happen any and everywhere. They had a nightmare called apartheid. It has ended. had a problem that the world at one time thought to be intractable. They are resolving it. So nowhere in the world can people ever again say, we have a problem that is intractable. So God says to Northern Ireland, to the Middle East, to Burma, to Sri Lanka, to wherever, God says, their nightmare ended. Your nightmare will end too. They had a problem. They are resolving it. You too will resolve yours. You, Middle East, are going to discover that enemy is a friend waiting to be made. That peace is possible because it happened in South Africa. It can happen here.